Welcome to Extraterrestrial Reality. Today I have a very special guest, Preston Dennett. He was on before one time, and he's back again. And of course, everyone who knows Preston, he has lots of books. He has over 50 books out now. He has a great YouTube channel, which I watch all the time. A lot of people in the UFO community love watching his channel. It's fantastic. And he has his latest book here has just come out. I just finished reading it. It's called Not From Here, Volume 5. And I really enjoyed it thoroughly. It was fantastic. And this is actually it was from the other books in this were in this series were not they were from articles that were published, but this one was not. There weren't. These are there's a lot of new stuff in here.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There's one that was previously published, but I expanded it to more than twice its original size. But yeah, all the previous books were pretty much drawn from articles I've written over, over 35 years now.
That's how long you've been investigating UFOs? 35 years.
It's closer to 40 now. I hate to say it, but yeah.
Well, I want to go through some of this, just talk, go through each section here. There's a bunch of different chapters. You actually have 10 different chapters and also an introduction and an epilogue. And you started off with UFO swarms. And of course, the most well-known one was the Farmington, New Mexico, 1950 incident. And this is a rare instance. You had some other cases in there as well. How rare is it? How rare are these?
Yeah, much rarer than I honestly thought they would be. Because, I ran into one in my own investigations and certainly knew about the Farmington case, which should be more well-known than it is. A lot of people don't know about it. And I thought, this could be an interesting study. I bet there's more out there. And there were a few. But no, I expected to find a lot more. I found less than a dozen cases and kind of threw out a couple of them because there just wasn't enough information. I know there's more out there.
And these involve, just so people know, or people see like 50 or more. Is that what that is? And when you consider a swarm, when UFOs are just showing up in mass, like in incredible numbers, and it has to be pretty scary, I guess, in a way. It must seem apocalyptic for the people when they see this.
I can only imagine, but yeah, that's certainly a description I think that people would resonate with. But I mean, it's not unusual for a person when they have an encounter to see multiple objects. In fact, that's kind of the norm. When someone sees a UFO, more than likely there is another one kind of up there as a wingman, so to speak. 2 or 3, that's kind of more, I would say, equally as common as seeing a single object. And even, 5 or 10 is not terribly unusual. And there's a scattering of cases involving more than that, 20 perhaps, even 30. Above that, almost nothing. So I don't know why that would be super rare, but I think these cases do have some really important insights to them, some really important takeaways.
And the one that you were investigating, was that the Topanga Canyon one?
That was, yeah, June 14th, 1992. A bunch of people were calling the local police. Topanga Canyon's this little community, 8,000 residents back in 1992, right outside of Los Angeles, kind of right along the coast there, Southern California coast. I grew up there, actually. Never saw anything. Found out it was a hot spot. There's quite a bit of little nuggets here in the literature, like, oh, I was in Topanga and I saw this and that. I didn't know any of that until I found out UFOs were real in 1986. Found out I had some friends and family who had encounters, and a few of them were in Topanga. And I ended up writing a little article for the local newspaper, The Messenger, and kind of moved on to other cases. I was living in Canoga Park in 1992 when the editor of the newspaper called me to say that they had received a flood of calls from people in the canyon, and so had the local police station. And they wanted me to investigate. So I ended up giving my number to the police, got some calls from them, and started doing an investigation. But I ended up writing a whole book on this, this wave of sightings. But on June 14th, there were several people who were driving through this canyon, which is a pretty remote area, honestly, even though it's right next to LA. And one guy said he was chased by, 5 or 10 objects down the highway. Another said that they were chased by 3. They ended up pulling over and the objects darted away. One said they were followed very closely and they were taken on board. They had missing time.
Wow.
Yeah, there was quite a few calls coming in. These objects were hovering over their homes. People were in their homes and saw big bright beams of light coming down. Others stepped out and saw a single object or a couple. A lot of reports. I mean, I ended up getting about 20 or 30 independent reports on that night alone. And some involved a lot of objects. There was one guy, Bilbo Shears, was driving with 2 of his friends south through the canyon. And they pulled over because there was these bright, bright lights shining down. Got out of the car, and there was this huge kind of cigar-shaped craft. And there must have been 20, 30 objects, he said, coming out of it and swirling around and darting off, going back in it. They stayed and watched it for 20 minutes. And for some reason, drove off. So that was one that was really impressive. But to me, the report that really pointed towards this being what I would call a UFO swarm or a super fleet, might be another way of putting it, was this couple who I call Catherine and Daniel. They don't want their names used. They're not seeking publicity. They live very high in the canyon, about 2,000 feet. So this overlooks the ocean. It overlooks LA. They have a 360-degree view of the landscape around them. And they were drawn out of their house around 8 p.m. that night, before most of the activity was even being reported, by flashes of light coming from behind a ridge, actually. This is interesting to me because almost always when someone sees a UFO, it's swooping down from above or from the horizon, and it comes towards them and goes by or does what it does. But no, this was coming from below. And they counted, well, they weren't really counting at this point. They saw about 10 or 20 objects, oval-shaped, come up from behind this ridge and dart in various directions. And they thought, wow, what the heck was that? Went inside, and their dog was barking again, saw more flashes of light. They go outside, a repeat performance. And when it happened a third time, like 15 minutes later, the wife started counting them, because this was a lot of objects. And it kept going on all night long. I mean, they kept getting drawn outside, or they would stay outside at some point until about 10:30 or 11 p.m. And so she's counting all these objects coming up in groups. And I went up there and interviewed them face to face, and they showed me exactly where these objects are coming from. She says, I think there were about 200.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, that's what I said. And I turned to the husband, and he's like, well, I don't know. It might have been closer to 100. And, forgive me, I burst out laughing.
Only 100.
Yeah, only 100. Exactly. And he says, well, she's probably right. She was counting them. She was really upset. There was a whole lot of these things. Sometimes they came right over their head. They got a really good close look at these objects, which were not quite disc-shaped, but more half disc, kind of with a sort of tapered ends. And they made a slight buzzing noise, which is what other witnesses said. And I did later locate other witnesses. There was another guy who was on the other side of the canyon, looking, basically where that ridge was. I'm like, ooh, this is going to be interesting. And he's like, the whole area would just light up with this brilliant light, and all these discs would come out of this giant bright light. So maybe this was, how they're coming through from wherever they're coming from.
What year was that?
That was 1992.
1992.
Yeah, and I found another witness down by the ocean who saw object actually coming out of the ocean, a very large one and several smaller ones on that same night. I don't know what was going on in that night, but something was.
Was there a lot of newspaper coverage in the local newspaper coverage of this event when it was happening, or no?
No, not really. The editor of the Messenger wrote about it, and I did, and that generated some letters to the editor type of thing, like, oh yeah, I saw this, and I, because of me, I actually did get a lot of press coverage, but it was, it did end up getting in the Daily News and the LA Times and Dallas Morning News.
And this is similar to some of these. There's, like I said, it's not that many out there, but it's similar to the Farmington case where there was a lot of coverage in the newspapers, it seemed, in that area when you look back at it, and there was so many witnesses. And I just wonder, what is it? What's going on when there's these swarms showing up? Do you have any theories on that? Do you ever think
I
about it?
do. Well, I mean, there was a very early case on February 20th, 1947 at Syracuse University where you couldn't see them with the naked eye. This astronomer saw it through a telescope, about 100 objects. I thought, I don't know what's going on here, because that was the beginning of the modern age of UFOs. So maybe they were coming in large numbers. But the Farmington case, where half the town saw it, including, police and the mayor and, the press reporters, and, traffic stopped on streets. People came running out of their homes and places of work, schools, and watch this, is what researchers call a display. Because it's clear in the Farmington case, and I think in these other cases, that they don't care that they're being seen, and maybe even intentionally wanting to be seen.
Almost like a way of disclosing over time. Okay, we're going to show a whole bunch of people here. Not everybody else is going to see it, but these people are, and they're going to talk about it. And over time, that's maybe what is going on. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's what's going on, and I can only speculate. But this is a type of behavior that we see periodically, well, fairly frequently with UFOs, which are usually evasive. Let's face it. You can't just walk out and see a UFO. They come, they do what they're going to do, and off they go. But sometimes they will put on what amounts to a display. And that is so obvious. I mean, it's inescapable that that's what was going on in Farmington, because they darted around for an hour doing fantastic gyrations. I mean, coming from opposite sides of the sky, swirling around each other, coming towards each other, doing right angles, swooping down for over an hour, twice that day, actually. They left and they came back. It was photographed, not surprisingly. Yeah, I think that's the real important takeaway here, is they want to be seen, and they're putting on, this is my opinion, what amounts to sort of a publicity campaign. Because I think that they want people to know that, they're here, we're not alone.
And they have to know too the technology that we have at the certain times when they make these displays, because if they were to do something again, like say they did in Farmington or in the Canyon in 1992, if they were to do something like that again this time, and if there's a lot of people with cell phones, it's going to become, whoa, it's going to wake up the world. I would imagine if something like that were to happen again, especially in a heavily populated area, wouldn't that be, okay, we're here and everyone's going to know it at that point?
Yeah, which is so interesting, because we do have UFO waves that occur fairly regularly throughout the world. I mean, if the Phoenix Lights had happened today, it would be a different story. Or the Wytheville, Virginia wave in the late 1980s, or Hudson Valley, or Gulf Breeze, or there's a bunch of waves of activity.
Yes.
That were very widely viewed, but those are generally just a couple, well, not a couple, in some cases quite a few objects, but not like the Farmington wave. And I think, what's really interesting about these cases is it shows, there's not just one or two of these craft visiting our planet, coming down and doing things. They have a fleet that's, probably larger than our own. And when you see something like 200 objects, well, that couldn't possibly be government, because I can imagine that they've reverse engineered some of these craft. But to have a fleet of 200 of them back in, Farmington was 1950. There's no way that could be government.
No.
There's no way they'd do something like that anyway.
Yeah. So, why would they? The government, it wouldn't make any sense for the government to ever attempt something like that. That's against what they. I mean, they don't want people to be thinking about this. Apparently, that's what they're more interested in pretending it's not real. That's what they seem to be more interested in.
Certainly back then, the cover-up was very tight at that point.
And then another, moving on, I want to talk about in chapter 2, you're talking about calling all UFOs, and that's pretty much, you're talking about close encounters of the fifth kind, where people actually, it started a lot earlier than people realize. I guess I didn't realize how early it started until I read that it was something in the 40s or late 40s, where people start realizing if you start flashing lights up, strong lights in the sky, you might attract UFOs.
Yeah, people have been doing this for quite some time, not in any real public way, but I mean, there was a case from, 1954 in France, at an exhibition where they had turned on searchlight on and it apparently attracted this big, giant spherical UFO, which of course they tried to cover up. Project Blue Book actually did look into this, precursor of Blue Book, and said there's nothing to it. Don't pay any attention. Nothing here. But so many military observers saw this. So many people. It stayed there for over an hour. And it's not the only case like that. There's a really famous case in Ohio. It's called the Norwood Searchlight case. I found several cases involving searchlights where they turn them on, and what shows up? A UFO right in the searchlight. This is again, so clearly them wanting to be seen. And yeah, I think it can be an effective method because there's so many cases of this. When I was a very early researcher, I started getting cases myself. And one really kind of drove it home for me was I'd interviewed this gentleman by the name of Arnie Weiler, who worked for NBC as a set dresser and doing set design. And he was participating in a sort of publicity stunt, as it turns out, making a peacock's tail out of what they call pitchel lights, which are kind of attached to a programming system, and you can turn them on, and they're very bright and colored. And they were setting it all up, and what's really interesting is if you look at a peacock's tail, it's almost a full disc of colored lights.
Yeah.
Looks kind of like a UFO is what I'm saying. And so they had no sooner turned this thing on with these very bright lights, which, by the way, is in downtown Santa Monica. This is at the George Page Museum, the La Brea Tar Pits, a pretty populated area. And they turn them on, and 3 fiery kind of orange, white UFOs came swooping down. These weren't structured craft necessarily that they could tell, but they came swooping down, stopped, as if to kind of take a quick look at what's going on here. And Arnie, the guy I interviewed, turns to Rick Liebert, who was the brains behind the whole special effects, and says, "Look at that, UFOs!" And Rick looks up. He's like, "Oh yeah, this keeps happening every time I put up these lights and stuff." When I heard that, I'm like, Arnie, do you still have Rick's number? I'd really like to talk to him, because if this has happened before, this could be a real significant, event. Because I hadn't heard of CE5s at this point. It wasn't really in the literature. And, Stephen Greer, who pretty much formed CSETI and popularized it, hadn't formed that group yet.
Based on your research, it seems like he saw what because you were talking about this back then.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I kind of played a little tiny role in this, which is really cool. But I talked to Rick Liebert, and he's like, "Oh yeah, this has happened." I'm like, "Can you tell me another really good incident?" Because he's like, "Well, it's happened a lot, but I can't really tell you specifically." But I'm like, "If it's happened a lot, you can tell me." Think of it. And finally, he's like, "Well, there was one incident that I really remember clearly, because this was in, gosh, let me see. I think it was 78. Yeah, 1978, on top of what was then the tallest building in San Diego, bank building, where they had set up a green argon spectrophysics laser to play and beat to a rock station. This was, for a publicity stunt for a rock station, radio station. And there was 10 people up on top of this building. They set it all up. They got FAA approval, the whole deal. Turn this laser on, and this V-shaped craft comes swooping down. There was another right up above it, some distance away, and it had little lights along each arm of it. It came right low. I mean, he couldn't estimate exactly. He says could have been anywhere from 10 feet to 100 feet over. He says it was so low they could actually hear it thrumming. And it moved very, very slowly directly over the building and moved on. All of them saw it. So I'm like, wow. And I ended up writing for an article for UFO Universe magazine called "Calling All UFOs." And they published it. They were publishing a lot of my articles at that time. This was well before I'd written any books. And that's when Stephen Greer came into town in 1994 into LA to form CSETI in Los Angeles. And I attended his little lecture there. And he listed those two cases. He's like, here's a case from Preston Dennett. This is the best example I could find of how you can call down UFOs with lights. Like, oh my gosh, that's my case. It's like, and here's another. And he listed a couple of others. I talked to him about this later because, we ended up conversing quite a bit when he formed the group. He's like, yeah, I have to thank you. You actually gave me the kick in the butt I needed to get CSETI formed. So yeah, it was very cool. And we ended up, we had this little group in LA, and we did call down UFOs on a good half dozen occasions over a period of several years, 4 or 5 years.
It's very popular right now among a lot of people within the UFO community trying to call UFOs with lights, and that's where it all started. Your reporting led to all of this, actually.
Yeah. Well, Cisco Paz Wells, a contactee, was doing this long before. There's, he did kind of form a little group. Yeah, a lot of people have been doing this. But what I like about this concept is because it has become kind of the forefront of UFO research. But it's cool because you can basically, instead of studying passive UFO reports, you're actually studying the phenomena as it occurs. It's an excellent opportunity for live field work. And anybody can see a UFO this way by just, well, not, it does entail some luck, I think. It's not always going to work.
Yeah.
But also it has such potential. I mean, can you imagine if this resulted in a landing and an onboard experience and an ongoing relationship?
Maybe that's the way it would have to be. Maybe that's what we're going to find out as time goes on. I guess we'll maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's how we can do that kind of thing. And then, of course, you dispel the whole notion in chapter 3 about astronomers not seeing UFOs, because they do. They have over the decades. They've seen many astronomers have reported seeing UFOs, and there's been a lot of cases of that.
Yeah, and it's so needed dispelling because I was seeing it all over the internet, on Facebook and such. There's a lot of UFO groups. Like, why haven't any astronomers seen UFOs? If UFOs were real, there'd be astronomers who'd see them because they're outside at night and they're looking up. Well, of course. And the fact is they have, and a lot of them. In fact, there's a list put together by researchers involving some 300 cases. And I put some of the really popular ones, high profile astronomers, ones that we all know about, in this book, sort of to give ammunition to researchers and experiencers to fight against the skeptics and the debunkers, say there's nothing to this. Because here's some ammunition that's undeniable. Because we have people like Edmund Halley, the discoverer of course, Halley's Comet, who way back in 1676 had a really tremendous sighting of this huge object. He said it was a vast body bigger than the moon. He clocked it around 9,000 miles per hour. So that's far too slow for a meteor, but far too fast for anything we have. And that was way back in the day. And just if you can go through time and see all these amazing astronomers like William Herschel, who discovered Uranus, I think it was, and saw UFOs in 1783, kind of on the surface of the moon, unexplained lights. Lincoln La Paz, he's another high profile. I think probably my favorite, I've got a couple of favorites, honestly. Clyde Tombaugh, though, he discovered Pluto and got national headlines for it and earned a place permanently in astronomical fame. And then in 1949, he's with his family in New Mexico and sees a structured craft. His whole family saw it. It's moving across the sky and had little portholes on it. So he saw this. It was a somewhat brief sighting, yes, but as a professional astronomer, he can discard all natural phenomena. Because who would know better than someone whose job it is and who's really educated on this?
Yeah.
And he became a very vocal advocate, a proponent for UFOs, but could not get any astronomers or mainstream astronomy in general to take any interest in this subject. And it's tragic because here we have a really good witness. And this kept happening over and over again. There was a case, let me see, 1954, astronomer, I I think his name was Karl-Heinz Schaldak, who was working at White Sands in a professional capacity to basically monitor rocket launches, and saw a UFO. And he's like, this was not a meteor. I've seen 1,000 meteors. I know that what this wasn't. This was a craft of some kind, was his conclusion. Little did he know there was another military guy, a trained observer 17 miles away, who also saw it, which allowed them to basically compare notes and triangulate this object, determine its size, speed, all of it. And they spoke with Clyde Tombaugh because he was famous for seeing one, a UFO. And he said, you got to report this to Project Blue Book. They would be very interested. Blue Book, of course, being the Air Force UFO study group. And so we did. And they both wrote this long report and said, it's not a meteor, it's not a meteor, it's not a meteor. And Blue Book did no investigation. As far as I know, they didn't actually even talk to the astronomers. They just read the report and said, meteor. They declared it identified. So that's Project Blue Book for you.
Yeah.
But can I list one more case?
Yeah, go ahead. This is great.
Because this one, it's like, oh my gosh, what is wrong with people? 1954, November 1st, Frank Halstead, really well-known astronomer, very respected, is on a train in Death Valley, California with his wife during the day. And she saw it first outside the window, about a quarter mile away, this giant silvery cigar-shaped object. She's like, honey, look. And he saw it. It was moving pretty quickly. It was really low. And he said it was a blimp-shaped, but had no propellers, had no gondola, and was moving far too quickly to be a blimp. And he's looking at it, trying to figure out what the heck this could be, when he sees a classic flying saucer with it. Again, these objects are rarely alone. Honestly, if you see a single UFO, look around, because there's probably another one up there. Come to realize this. But at any rate, he saw this smaller object, which was the classic saucer, glinting in the sun, silver, darting around, turning at right angles, hovering, just doing all kinds of stuff. And they saw this for just a few minutes. And off they went, and the train went. But he became like Clyde Tombaugh, very vocal about this, wrote a big long report, spoke to anyone and everyone he could find to try to get them to take this seriously. Because he said, I saw a craft. This was a craft. This was not made on Earth. This was an unearthly vehicle. We need to talk about this. UFOs are real. Still could not get mainstream astronomy on board.
It's funny, like there's all this, like, I'm so glad you have this chapter. And then I'm glad you brought that story up, because that was, in my mind, the one that really stood out to me, the train sighting. But it's funny, I think that there's like a disinformation campaign here, because like, oh yeah, astronomy doesn't take this seriously, but yet you're showing here all throughout the centuries, actually, there has been astronomers that have seen these things, and they're very clear that these things were not they couldn't have been human made.
Yeah, in fact, J. Allen Hynek, who worked for Project Blue Book as an astronomy consultant, finally surveyed a bunch of astronomers and found out that that population of astronomers sees UFOs more than the average person, and none of them are talking about it. He found a bunch of astronomers who saw UFOs, and they said, no, I'm not going to talk. I'm afraid of tarnishing my reputation. And several told him, even if I did see one, I wouldn't talk. And, that was confirmed by another guy, Peter Sturrock. I think he was a Harvard astronomer as well, but Jacques Vallée, who we all know,
yeah,
has written a bunch of books. He's been in this field forever. He's an astronomer and came into this field out of very interesting coincidence. He was at an observatory when they had caught proof. They had solid evidence of unknown objects in our atmosphere. And he watched them destroying the evidence. And they're like, what are you doing? They said, we can't explain these, so we're just not going to deal with it. And he was unbelievably horrified. He's like, this is not science. What are you doing? This is really interesting. We need to look into this. This is what brought him into the field. So, man, oh man,
Yeah, just to destroy it. Wow.
Can you imagine how much really good evidence we could have had if we weren't all basically victims of the cover-up?
I hope they didn't destroy the Roswell evidence. I'm always worried about that. I hope they still have. I hope they're keeping it safe.
I'm sure it's somewhere. I mean, we know it is because the Roswell craft is such a good case. It was tracked from people who saw it crash. People saw.
There's so many witnesses to the cover.
People who studied it.
Yeah, it's just too
somewhere.
much there. Yeah, there has to have the information somewhere on that. I hope.
I want to see it.
So do I.
I'm in this field because the cover-up has to end at some point.
It's a bucket list. It's coming. It's got to.
The truth. You can hide the truth, right? You can distort it. You can lie about it and ignore it, but you can never destroy it. No. Truth is truth.
Yes, it's coming. There's no doubt in my mind. Because of these things, it's coming. Because of these things. It's going to become undeniable at some point very soon. I think it's already there. The evidence, I've been talking about it on the show recently. I think we already have the evidence, and it's just a matter of time till everyone sees it.
100% agree. Yeah.
Yes. And then another interesting chapter 4. This was something else. Aliens at UFO conferences. This was really wild stuff here. I mean, wow. I mean, some people getting abducted in their hotel rooms at a place you were at. One of the places when this stuff was going on, actually.
Yeah, I remember the first time this even crossed my mind at all was in San Diego. There was a conference being held at the Del Coronado Hotel on Coronado Island in 1994, the Triad Conference. There was a lot of famous researchers there: Colin Andrews, Yvonne Smith, Don Ecker, Bud Hopkins. And I went there because I wanted to hear Bud Hopkins in particular speak, and Yvonne Smith. I was staying at a friend's house who lived right along the beach, about just a short distance from the hotel. But it turned out a bunch of people, attendees, contactees, some of them, were staying at the Village Inn, which is a stone's throw from where I was and a stone's throw from the Coronado Hotel. We're all taken on, had visitations on that one night. These were 3 separate adjoining rooms in one hotel. And it turns out they were not the only ones. I ended up writing a book with one of the witnesses, and so did Yvonne Smith, because there was quite a few other witnesses in other locations. So I thought, that's interesting. It wasn't at the conference itself, but it was the day before, and it was right next door, and it was close. But it was some years later, I was speaking at the MUFON Internet or National Group about USOs. This was in Irvine in California. And this was, gosh, I forget the date that was. 2015, I think.
2015. Yeah, it's pretty recent. It was, yeah.
Yeah, it was fairly recent. At any rate, one of the guys who was attending the conference was Knox. His last name is
yes.
Thomas Michael Knox. That's right. And here's my dog. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. I have a dog too. Sometimes she'll be barking when I'm doing these.
Whenever I'm doing a show, she wants to be part of it. But yeah, Thomas was in his hotel room. This is Knox, at the conference, and doesn't really remember anything. But at the time, he was suffering from a torn Achilles tendon that needed surgery. He had a roommate who woke up in the middle of the night and saw Grays coming into the hotel room and, doing work on him. And she remembers being taken on board. She remembers seeing several of the speakers on board this craft. I was one of the speakers. I don't remember this.
Were you there? Were you?
I would love to talk to this witness because she's anonymous. She reported this to the NUFORC, National UFO Reporting Center. Because I would like to know if I was on, if she saw me. But I know Linda Zimmerman was there, Stanton Friedman. There was some, big names there. And she reported seeing speakers, presenters on board this craft. And Thomas Michael Knox woke up in the morning and his Achilles tendon was no longer detached. So this was extraordinary physiological evidence of an encounter. And there
They
was
healed
more,
him, and they healed him, and plus he had marks on his body, right?
right? And weird fluorescence, and of course, he had some memories of this, I believe. At any rate, it turned out there was another witness, a group of them outside the hotel who saw UFOs on that same night over the hotel. Oh my gosh, I wonder if this is. Well, actually, what happened was this guy came out with a book. Uh, what's his name? Reverend John Polk came out with a book called Blue Beings at the Conference. And this was August 29, 2015, in Portland, Maine, where he says he was at the table in the convention hall when these very kind of tall, unusual looking, bluish skinned beings came in and were asking strange questions and behaving strangely. And there's other witnesses who were there. One lady who was taking people's money, she says they didn't seem to even know how to use money. Let me see, Travis Walton was speaking there. I think Stephen Greer. And a number of I ended up finding a witness, and she's like, well, yeah, I saw what everyone was talking about, and I'm not entirely convinced, but they were unusual looking. I will say that.
So what do you think? You think they're just? I mean, I guess are they monitoring these things? I mean, the people that you have a conference with a bunch of people that are studying and interested in UFOs. I guess they would be interested in that. That's probably why they're showing up, right? Was that what do you think?
Appropriate, in a weird way. It's like, what better place? I mean, if there's a bunch of contactees getting together, well, that would make it easy. Let's pick up all these people. I'm purely speculating, but it's certainly an interesting thing to think. Like, here's all these people who are interested in UFOs. Here's all these people who are having experiences. Here's all these researchers. What better place to have an encounter? And there's quite a few cases, actually. And there was a huge conference at Giant Rock back in the 50s that was held for decades. And, well, I'm not sure it was decades, but it was held for a number of years. And to this day, the most popular UFO conference, attracting several thousand people. And we're talking as big or bigger than Contact in the Desert. And there was a sheriff who got a really good picture of a UFO. There were some reports of people seeing humanoids. I think probably my favorite case of this kind was basically a close encounter of the first kind, a sighting. But it was at Contact in the Desert in 2016 in Joshua Tree, California. And what happened is fascinating because a bunch of people went out for a sky watch after all the speakers had, done their presentations, and UFOs showed up. And it wasn't just one or two; it was a dozen, or I think it was up to 20 of them. And these were mostly just kind of lighted objects, but they were different colors. I mean, there would be a green object, and then a blue, and then a red, and they were moving around, and sometimes in groups. A couple of times they did what we would call unconventional or non-ballistic movement, stopping, turning at right angles. And what's so amazing about this is there was a lot of witness testimony to this. I found a good 10 or 20 of them. And people were looking through binoculars. Allegedly, there's film of this as well. I couldn't find it, but people were looking through night vision as well. It was a big buzz all about this when UFOs showed up at this conference. And I found
when they looked through the binoculars, were they just the lights just magnified, or could they make out form or like metal?
No, they could not make out form. Which is not that unusual, because when something is, I've come to realize this, having interviewed a lot of people, they'll see a star-like object and it comes lower and lower and it's very bright and fiery, and it might change color, but as it comes down and comes to a landing, you can see it's a metallic craft. But basically, it usually has to be pretty low and stop because these craft, basically, this is my assessment, my understanding, are moving in such a way that these sort of very superheated plasma fields surround them. And they're very fiery in appearance often. So you see this bright orange glow. though not, and it can be blue when it's moving away or red when it's coming in, which I think is a significant observation. But yeah, these are interesting cases, and I'm guessing there's more out there because every time I, put out something like this, it sparks more reports. I haven't gotten any yet, but I think there's more out there. And yeah, I think it's strangely appropriate and kind of interesting that it would happen at a UFO conference.
I never was personally at one of these conferences. Maybe I should try to go and see if I could, find maybe something will happen. Who knows?
Yeah,
because I've already had my experiences, so I know I've already seen it. I don't know if I'm not sure if I want to have it happen again, but who knows? Maybe I would. I don't know. We'll see.
Nothing like a personal experience.
No, there's not.
Belief turns to knowledge, and there's a big difference between the two.
Yeah, exactly. And then you had Chapter 5, UFOs in the American sitcom, which I thought was very, very interesting, and was, a different kind of something in the middle of this, something to think about. But I, all these different old TV shows where they talked about UFOs. The one I thought was the most interesting, personally, was the episode. I did not know this. I used to watch My Three Sons reruns growing up in the 70s. But the episode you're talking about there, the kid was covering up for the government at the end of it.
Yeah. I was, I enjoy sitcoms. I do. I love humor and would always, get kind of a little bit tickled with delight when they would cover the UFO subject. I'm like, oh, here we go. I wasn't a fan of Golden Girls so much, but I heard about the episode. I'm like, I have to see this one. And, Married with Children, I did watch. That was a very funny UFO episode. But it was on Barney Miller, I Love Lucy, I Dream of Jeannie, Bewitched. I mean, you name it. They have covered this.
Yes, the Flintstones you were talking about, too. There was a lot of good episodes with, the Great Gazoo, as well as the one with the Ted Freds running around.
Some never did, like Seinfeld and Friends and others, which I kind of get because each sitcom has their sort of tone or theme. And some like to get a little more wacky, I guess. I don't think UFOs are wacky, though. That's the thing.
No.
And I'm really pleased to see that this subject being covered, but it wasn't. I started to get really upset. I'm like, okay, here's being covered again. And I noticed this awful pattern, which I think is frankly dangerous the way it's being presented and inaccurate, at least. Because in every single darn episode, whenever it's covered, it's the same thing. Very early episodes, it was always a hoax. It wasn't true. There's nothing to UFOs. If it's anything, it's government. But as time went on, they portrayed it as actual ETs. But in every single episode of every single sitcom, the person who sees the UFO is the least reliable character. It's Betty White, the ditzy on Golden Girls. It's the little kid on My Three Sons. It's always the one with no brains, the gullible one, the youngest, the oldest. Someone who's been drinking or some. It's just so unfortunate because that's not true. It's just not true. People of all levels of society, all educational levels, there's no discrimination in terms of who sees a UFO.
Yeah, those shows, actually, what you're saying, that does make it does enhance the stigmatization. That's what it did in some of those episodes, like the Brady Bunch one, where it was a hoax. Greg was playing around there with, so I do remember that episode too. But I didn't remember. I don't remember the My Three Sons one. I got to check that one out. But so
it was actually really good. They got photographs. I like the way it was treated.
Yeah, that was treated a little bit better. It sounds like it was treated a little bit better than some of these other ones, maybe.
My favorite was Barney Miller, I think, because they did treat, although the kind of ditzy cop was the one who saw it. They treated this in a very accurate portrayal of how UFOs do actually appear. And I will say, towards the second half of all these portrayals, as time goes on, you see a bit of a progression there. They always treat this as a real phenomenon. And they certainly did in that one, because he was vindicated at the end when a bunch of people turned out they had called the police as well and were reporting these objects. So I'm encouraged that we're making progress.
Yes. I think we are. So it does seem like it is more seriously taken more seriously today than it used to be. It used to be a joke. It was portrayed more as in a joking fashion, and like you said, the goofiest person in the show would be the one who sees it. I think things are changing as time goes on.
A little bit. sitcoms are kind of a joke in and of themselves, right?
Yes.
And I did notice something like, okay, yeah, they're being very thoroughly covered on sitcoms, but what about dramas? No,
No, never, never.
no, no, no.
It's almost are afraid of it. It's I don't know. I just don't know. They maybe they think their show won't be taken seriously if they have an episode where there's UFOs or alien encounters, because people don't believe that. We're not supposed to believe in that. I guess that's the way.
Do it.
Yeah, just do it.
Receive Hill Street Blues. They should have covered it.
Yes.
LA Law. This does get into court sometimes. This subject. CSI. This would make a good CSI episode.
Definitely, yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah, definitely.
Some physical evidence there. Let's deal with this.
And then you go in chapter 6. You're talking about the twin connection, where all the Jim and Jack Weiner. You talk about that instance. They were part of 2 of the Allagash 4. Among other twins were, and that's very strange stuff was actually in that chapter. In fact, it seems like sometimes there are women who are, they're going to have twins, but then right before the birth, one of them disappears. That there was a lot of weird stuff going on there. It seems like aliens are interested in twins.
Yeah, well, I think we need more research on this area, because I did start to notice. When I was interviewing people, they're like, "Oh, I'm a twin." I'm like, "Oh no, really interesting," because that turned up a little bit more than you think it would, because twins in the population are still relatively rare, and there seem to be quite a few contactees who are twins, like the Kinsella twins in England, and there's Audrey and Debbie Hewins. They're pretty well known in this field. Of course, the Jack and Jim Weiner. In the Allagash case, investigated by Ray Fowler, they said when they were taken on board, they did receive special attention, which they felt was because of their twin status. I interviewed one guy. He's a Navy medic who had an encounter with praying mantis type ETs, which was very benevolent. He was basically invited on board. And he's like, "You should talk to my brother, my twin. He's had an encounter too." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, here we go again." Because I did investigate a case with a missing twin, and the kid was born, and he started talking about seeing his twin brother. He didn't even know he had a twin. And I interviewed a lady by the name of Dolly Safran, wrote a whole book about her case. Her mother was pregnant with twins, and then wasn't. And she would later meet her identical twin on board the UFO. Got a few cases of that.
Wow.
And now I know to ask this, because I didn't. I put out a book, Humanoids and High Strangeness, and one of the witnesses heard me talking about this. She's like, "I didn't tell you. I didn't think." Yeah, my mother was pregnant with twins, and one's missing. So,
yeah, wasn't there a case? There was something in there too about where one of the twins actually went on board the craft while the other twin that no one knew about was
yes.
took his place. That was weird.
That was another case. I'm like, wow, that's from RD6 Killer Clark. And I like her as a researcher because, unlike many researchers, she's not doing a lot of cherry picking and shoe fitting and censoring. She interviews people and tells their story. And I really appreciate that. That's kind of my MO. I'm not here to convince you of any agenda. I just want people to have factual information as we know it. And she had this case where a kid was taken on board as a young man and met his twin. And they traded places because twin wanted to experience life on Earth and learn. So this sounds like a sitcom in and of itself. It makes you wonder how many cases there are. I mean, gosh, can you imagine the parents? But I think this is interesting to me because there's a bunch of cases where people are taken on board and see, say, human-looking ETs. And almost every one of these cases, they're like, gosh, they looked so much alike. They could have been twins. I hear that a lot.
I wonder if that case we you're talking about if that's real, and the other twin that was staying with the family for a couple of weeks, were they just wondering, no, he's acting funny the last couple of weeks. I don't know if they noticed anything different.
I don't know. I would love to follow up on some of these cases.
Yeah.
That's very difficult to do, especially when it's I've reached out to RD6 Killer Clark, but she's very private. doesn't do a whole lot of appearances.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And then you talk in chapter 7, an alien by any other name. You got into the name. There's actually names that the aliens, that people find out that they actually have names. They're not just numbers or whatever people might think. They actually have names.
Yeah, this first came to my attention when I was interviewing a lady who had encounters with a gray, well, an encounter with a gray alien who introduced himself as Kevin. I thought, oh, that's crazy. She's like, yeah, I think it is crazy. I think he just said that, to make me a little more comfortable. I'm like, huh. Because I remember that there are other cases. There was Carl Higdon of Rawlins, Wyoming, was taken on board. It's a very famous case. But the ET introduced himself as Also 1. I don't know what happened to Also 2 or Also 3. But it's an odd name, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's Indrid Cold from Woody Derenberger, another famous case. And started thinking, I'm like, gosh, are there other cases of this? Because one lady I interviewed saw a gray, and he introduced himself as Quai. And that, of course, rang a bell with Betty Andreasen, very well-known contactee from Ashburnham, Massachusetts, who had a contact with the gray by the name of Quazga. And I thought, gosh, that's so interesting, because as I was doing my research, there was another lady from, I think it was Indiana, by the name of Barbara Schutte. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. Schutte. So I guess it would be Schutt.
Yeah.
I don't know. But at any rate, she described an ET, she drew it almost identical to Betty Andreasen. And what's so interesting is this ET introduced himself as Quazga, pretty much the same darn name. And apparently these two did not know each other. And looking into this, there's been no research on this almost at all. I found a little bit here and there, but not really, no, because every facet of UFOs are researched to death, whether it's landing traces or, what the inside of a craft looks like, and, UFO propulsion and all of this, but not a whole lot on this aspect. So I started collecting all the names, and there was a lot of them. There was, one case where the ET said, I am the highest ranking female on this craft. I'm the pilot. And I think her name was Nelda. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but I put together like a little baby book of alien names. And some are quite unusual. Bill Hamilton, a well-known researcher and ended up being a contactee, was introduced to a gray who called himself Qualar. I thought that was interesting. But yeah, you get a whole wide variety of names. Now, Whitley Strieber did hook up with a guy who's an expert on Gaelic languages, because Betty Andreasen was kind of giving some of these words she was saying turned out to be Gaelic. And they started looking into some of these names, which have their Gaelic equivalents. So there could be some, like all names have some sort of meaning to them. Like some of the contactees had really unusual names for their ETs, but Aura Rains, that was from Truman Bethlehem. A number of ETs with that name, Aura, which of course has obvious meaning of an aura. I think the most interesting one was from a contactee by the name of Gene Robinson, who was introduced to a gray, and she asked, what's your name? What's your name? And he said, my name is Quetzal. Well, that's very much like, Quetzalcoatl of ancient Aztec. If you look into that, it's like, well, they came down and they're sky gods, and they taught people agriculture and science and philosophy. So I'm wondering about that. Could this be the same people? I don't know. It was an interesting aspect, which I kind of looked into it for fun, and I started getting more interested in it.
I liked it because it was, again, what this book that is giving you, you're getting a broad view here in this, and this was another interesting aspect that's never really talked about. I never, it's just something that you're presenting, and I thought it was great.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It shows a human side to them, kind of.
Yes. And now one of the scarier chapters here was chapter 8. You have been warned, and pretty much the message is the same pretty much all the time. It seems like there's a lot of different cases that you list in there, and it seems like they're giving us warnings about what's to come if we don't straighten up.
Yes, and it's been very consistent since the first onboard experience, and I don't care who it is, whether it's the contactees of the 50s, which some researchers don't really believe. Some are, of course, taking a second look at people like George Adamski and Truman Bethram and Daniel Fry. But there was a lot of them, Orfeo Angelucci, Howard Menger. They were getting these messages against nuclear proliferation and the destruction of the environment way back then. Of course, the idea of grays and people being taken on board sort of shifted to that. And they gave the same message as well. And so do the praying mantis and the human looking and the little blue guys. I mean, any strange humanoids, all of them are giving the same message. And if you look into the work of any major researcher out there, whether it's Bud Hopkins or David Jacobs or John Mack or Barbara Lamb or Yvonne Smith, Edith Fiore, you name it, every single one of them have these cases, almost without exception. And there's been a lot of speculation as to what's going on here, because David Jacobs, who takes a pretty dim view of the whole UFO contact phenomenon, says, well, I don't know if I even believe these. I think they're just studying people's emotions, because they will show them an atomic blast and say, this you're on the pathway towards this. This could happen. And he thought they were studying people's emotions. And there's a few researchers who have postulated that, or that it's perhaps something along the lines of scare tactics, because sometimes they will give predictions which don't necessarily come true or haven't yet. So they're thinking, well, maybe they're just trying to get us on the pathway to the right path before it's too late. But I have to tell you, looking into this, I always go to the experiencers. I'm not going to go to our government for answers, because they're not going to give it to us. No. Everything we know that we can count on as valid information comes from one source, and that's the experiencers. And by and large, they believe that they are being given true warnings, accurate predictions. And we're seeing it come true right now. Look at the Zimbabwe Ariel Elementary School case, where in 1994, they were warned about the destruction of the forests. What's happening now? We've destroyed half of the forests on our planet. If you look at how badly Earth has been deforested, it is frightening. And they're also warned about becoming far too technological. This is what Emily Trim was told. There's a good way to use technology and a bad way, and you could do better. Well, we've certainly learned that, haven't we?
Yeah.
I mean, we're polluting our water, our air, our food, and ETs have been warning us from the beginning. And I listed all these contactee cases because some are pretty dire warnings. Like Walter Rizzi was basically told that at some point there's probably going to be a pole tilt. That comes up quite a bit. Dolly Saffron, I've mentioned her a couple of times. She's been told in very plain language that we are facing a collapse of the magnetic fields of our planet due to coronal mass ejections and sunspot activity, and what is coming is a micronova from our sun. It's a regular natural cycle. And I've always gotten these contactee reports of the sky filling with ships, and people like, one day we're going to be scooped up if there's an existential crisis. Sometimes people would say, well, this came to me in dreams. Others were told very specifically about this. Others kind of got the impression. I mean, it comes in different ways, but it's a fairly consistent message given to contactees. And when I asked Dolly Saffron about this, she's like, oh, yeah, this is absolutely what we're facing right now. This is serious stuff. In fact, she said right now, our magnetic fields are 40% or 40% below normal. And you can see the science on this. There is good science on this if you do your research. She says right now it's gotten so bad that they have left, the ETs. What people are seeing now is not ET. It is mostly government reverse engineered craft. I interviewed this guy who's, I'm like, here's your chapter. I put his story in my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. I'm like, is there anything you want to add to this? He's like, well, you're talking about CE5s. You need to tell people that this can be poor, ill-advised is how he put it. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He says, well, a lot of what people are seeing is government, and they are putting forth a false flag. They've got bad intentions, and there's a lot of buzz about this in the UFO community now, sort of false flag, fake ET invasion. And you could be calling down something that's not, end up being MILAB, as you might have heard that term, MILAB.
Yes.
We've got a lot going on right now with this field. It's a mess.
It seemed like their biggest issue is like the nuclear technology that we're
100%.
That seems like the biggest concern that they, and also the fact that one of the things that might happen here is at some point it's going to get to a point where it gets so bad that they're going to take people off the planet. That's what that's what you're talking about in there.
Yeah, I know that sounds like science fiction. ETs, filling the sky and coming down and scooping people up. I sort of cringe when when I'm talking to skeptics, say I'm talking about this because it sounds so outlandish. But I have to tell you, it's not uncommon that people will get this message. So I wondered about this from the beginning because so many people have told me this. I'm like, well, gosh, people have said basically it's my job to make sure that people aren't freaking out. I've talked to some people, they pass on since then, but they're like, yeah, this is what I'm supposed to do, is make sure people aren't freaking out and basically lead them onto the craft in the event of what we would term an existential crisis, which is actually kind of, encouraging in a way, because it's clear we are on a pathway towards self-destruction. I mean, we really are. Look at the nuclear arsenals that are just continuing to build, and in countries that are, still warring with each other. It's almost inevitable at some point, we're going to have to deal with some real heavy duty stuff if we don't become more peaceful, if we don't start evolving spiritually, psychically, or wherever we want it, morally, ethically, might be a better term.
Well, I don't even know. I mean, I think we're at a point now where I think it's impossible for the human race itself to disarm at this point. I just don't think it's possible. I think we would have to have an intervention. It would take aliens coming here and doing something about it. I think we're beyond, unless we get a message from aliens to tell us, hey, you better stop, you better disarm right now, or you're done. I don't know. I mean, what do you think? I mean, are we beyond it?
That's why I titled that chapter, "You Have Been Warned," because we have been. And if you look at like cases of like the Eisenhower meeting in 1954, there's some good reporting on that. I think that actually happened. I don't think we traded technology with ETs. That's some disinformation. But I think, if you look into this, there's some really good evidence that this did take place, and that ETs basically came down and warned us about nuclear weapons and the use of them and the growing arsenal, and that we should disclose. And we've said basically no to both. We want our nukes, and we're going to continue to lie to the American public. Well, let's face it, this is not unique to America.
Yeah, the world leaders everywhere, they're just lying. We're getting lied out from everywhere for some reason here. It's ridiculous.
So, such a shame, yeah. And I don't think the ETs are going to come down and disarm us, because they haven't. And that's the closest we ever got, I think, in terms of a really publicly well-known incident, is the Maelstrom in 1967, when they did basically disengage our intercontinental ballistic missiles. But did they take them away? No. Did they destroy them? No. They rendered them temporarily inoperable for a day. That's it. And that's such a clear-cut case of a slap on the wrist, a warning. I can see from a military standpoint how they might perceive this as being somewhat concerning, I'll put it that way. But to me, I'm far more concerned about how our, I'll call it secret government cabal, well, we know who's behind it. It's the highest levels of the military. It's the Pentagon. It's the intelligence agencies, who are not elected officials. None of them. The military-industrial complex, these super rich, massive companies like, Monsanto, and the banking industry, and the oil industry, insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry. We know who's behind the cover-up. So those are the folks I'm worried about. The ones who are hoarding all the wealth, 99% of the wealth, and causing divisiveness and polluting our food and water intentionally. You can't go to the store now and buy food that's not genetically modified. Well, you can, but I encourage people to start reading their ingredients, because animals won't even eat genetically modified food. They know something we don't.
It's just weird, too, that, well, why are we what's enough to these people? I guess, how much power, how much money, how much wealth do they need? That doesn't make any sense to me. It's like, most of us live, day by day, week by week, or whatever, and it's but they have so much that, I mean, what more? Why? It doesn't make any sense to me. That's the issue. One of the issues I have with
Makes
the
no
way.
sense to me either. I mean, how much money do you need? It's all
Yeah.
about greed, power. It's corruption. They've made very poor decisions, and I think one day, I'm hoping, that they'll come to the realization that they made poor decisions.
Yes.
We're only on Earth for a short time, and we move to a higher dimension, and I think that's when they're going to realize, well, you know what? Maybe I should have done things a little differently.
Yeah.
We'll see. I don't know, but karma is a thing. ETs even talk about karma, by the way. Got a number of cases where they've actually brought that up. So,
Karma is definitely a thing. I've seen it in the works many times in my life. And moving on to chapter 9, aliens abducted my dog. This was very interesting. All these cases, there was cases where people's dogs were abducted and they never be seen again. There were cases where there were attempts to be abducted, and there were cases where there were some close calls.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I kind of got interested in this when I heard about a case from Ukraine where a little boy was about to be taken. He's like, no, I want to take my dog with me. And they're like, okay, fine. I'm like, huh, well, that's interesting. And, Dolly Saffron said the same thing. Oh, yeah, when I was a little girl, they'd let me take my dog Heidi. I'm like, oh, really? Wow. And I heard a case from Constance Clear, a Midwestern researcher who was interviewing this guy from Texas. He had an encounter and he saw a dog on board. I'm like, okay, this is odd. And so I started kind of taking note of this. And what really kind of caught my eye was this one case from Louisiana. This gentleman had a dog that he loved named Hunter Bone. This guy's a backwoods bayou guy, right? And he was taking his dog hunting, and this UFO comes down for a landing, and his dog, Hunter Bone, comes running for this UFO. So he runs towards the UFO too, because he's trying to protect his dog, who he loves. And next thing he knows, he's on board. And this was a fairly typical onboard experience, which was benevolent, he said. He was given the standard exam. He was warned about nuclear proliferation and wars. He was given a tour of the craft, shown, I believe it was another planet in our solar system. So you're fairly extensive onboard experience. But at one point, he's like, my dog, where's my dog? And I said, oh, well, he's right there. And he was paralyzed and he was floating through the craft like a stuffed animal. He's like, don't worry, your dog is fine. He tried to bite us. We had to do that. He's going to be fine. But yeah, another case from Oregon where a guy had a UFO land in his backyard. And he starts talking to these little guys. And they're like, oh, well, we needed to do a landing. And would you like to go on board? And he's like, sure. And he and his dog went on board. And he had, again, the tour type of thing and messages and the whole deal. And he says his dog, who was blind in one eye, they healed the dog and gave him more energy and healed him as well of arthritis. So I found a number of cases of dogs healed. So some really interesting cases. There was quite a few. There was one case in November of 1957. First 2 weeks, this is one of the biggest waves in history. Turned out we had just launched Sputnik. I don't think this is a coincidence, because suddenly there's this wave of sightings, landings, cars being stalled. This was a huge car stalling couple of weeks, which changed the way everyone viewed UFOs, especially at higher levels. So I thought, oh my gosh, this is concerning. They can shut up our cars. prior to this, they thought that might be an accidental byproduct. Now they weren't so sure. But there was this 2 cases that occurred on the same day, widely separated. One in, Everettstown, New Jersey, and one in Dante, Tennessee. One involved a little boy, Everett Clark, who went to walk his dog early in the morning on November 6, 1957, and saw this UFO landed in a field next to his house. Human looking, but short. ETs walking around. He thought they were speaking a foreign language. It sounded a little like German, he thought. At any rate, they tried to take his dog. And his dog was like not having it and barked and barked and barked. And the dog came running back, and that was basically that. Though they did find really impressive landing traces. And it was later that evening, quite far away in New Jersey, Everett, New Jersey, that another guy, John Trasco, and his wife saw a landed UFO. Out came this short little ET speaking a different language, but actually walked up to him and asked for his dog. And John Trasco's like, no, you can't have my dog. Get off my land. But it was amazing that this is such a similar case on the same darn day.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, and there was a lot of weird cases you had in the dog. The one with there was one in Wales from 1992 that you had where Keith Robbins was camping with some other friends. I guess they were teenagers, and the dog and the car was gone. They went back and they just got out of the car. They're looking around, and then he turned around his car, and the dog was gone. And yes, there was UFO. They saw a weird something, lights flying around.
Going to the police saying, ETs took my car. They stole my car and my dog. He swears up and down this happened. He says, no one will ever convince me otherwise. I'm going to say this to the day I die because this happened to me. And he has witnesses. And I found over 24 cases of this sort of thing. So I think there has to be something going on here. And it's odd because, I looked into cats. I couldn't find any cases. A couple. But, people have all kinds of pets. I certainly did find a number of cases in prior volumes of the Not From Here books. I did a chapter called Alien Zoos because they do collect animals, whether it's rabbits or, fish or crocodiles or, you name it. There's an example of, elk. Carl Higdon saw elk on board the UFO. So they are clearly, and of course, they're digging soil samples. And remember the Valençol case in France?
Where
they were taking his lavender plants?
Yeah.
Lots of cases of them taking. There was a case in I think it was Mexico, where this lady's plant was getting stripped of leaves, her split-leaf philodendron. And finally, the neighbor said, there was a UFO hovering over your house. And then the next day comes and she hears someone on her porch. It's these little gray aliens stripping her houseplant of its leaves.
They're interested. They're definitely interested in all of these things, it seems like, in plants and in animals or dogs. I don't know why. I had an incident where my dog, when I was living in Hawaii, disappeared mysteriously for 2.5 hours, which I think could have been extraterrestrial related.
You're the guy I talked to. Yeah, you told me that. I was trying to think, I know I heard this before.
I don't have any. The only thing I could say is that the dog disappeared just right. Like, 1 second it was there, and the next second it was gone, and then 2.5 hours later, after searching and searching, I couldn't find it, and then I gave up. And right when I gave up, the dog rose up in some bushes right in front of me, in this low to the ground jungle in Hawaii, and the chain was around her neck, and I thought, well, she must have broke the chain and everything. But then I saw the other end of it, and it was in a loop. And I had it looped around this post that was holding the house up. There was these houses. It was in a tropical rainforest, and the house was on stilts. So I couldn't figure out how that could have possibly happened. I didn't see anything, but the dog was gone for 2.5 hours and then just mysteriously returned.
Well, see, I remember you telling me this earlier. That was one of the things. I'm like, gosh, I need to look into this. Because
I'll put it in writing, and then you could include it in down the road, so you can get the whole story.
There's something going on there. It's really interesting.
Yes,
there's so many cases of this.
Yes, and then finally, we're at your favorite chapter is alien books, which I think is very interesting as well. Sometimes people get books. Sometimes they see books that aliens put together.
I was actually thrilled about this because I found one case and then another, and these are some really well authenticated cases. I just recently found another case. Couldn't believe it. I'm like, gosh, I missed this one. I'm so mad because I couldn't put it in the book. But we all know the Betty and Barney Hill case, so I won't belabor it. But she had this experience where she's just about to walk off the craft. She's like, could I have an artifact? I'd love to take something that will prove this experience. And the ET said, okay, sure. What do you want? Look around. She's like, I'd like that. She's like, what's that? He's like, oh, well, you're not going to be able to read this. She's like, well, that's not the point. She flipped through it. There were symbols and stuff. And she's like, I might not be able to read it. Someone might be able to, but that's not the point. I want it for proof. He's like, okay. So mind you, the ramp is down on the craft. Barney's walking down, and she's at the entrance, or the exit, as you might say, but about to step off the craft. And suddenly the ETs behind her start talking. And like, nope. And then he takes it back. And she's furious. She's like, this is my proof. And the guy who gave it to her said, well, that's the point. They don't want you to have it. This could cause problems for you that we didn't think about initially. And she's like, oh, I'm so mad. And like, no, you're probably not even going to remember this encounter. She's like, oh, yes, I will. And of course she did. It did take her a little bit, but she recalled it. And that was a really famous case. But Betty Andreasen also had this experience and described it the same way, a little blue book, thin. She said it had glowing white pages. And the ETs gave it to her and let her keep it at home for 2 weeks to peruse when she had the opportunity. They said, don't show it to anybody. She showed it to her daughter, Becky, which I'm glad she did, because that gave additional corroboration, which Becky did provide. And they never fully found out what was in it. Betty said it was philosophical and spiritual advice that was meant really only for her. And researchers put her under hypnosis and tried to get the information, and she just wouldn't. She clammed up. She said, I can't speak. So we never really found out what was in it. But I started to find other cases, because this happened to a gentleman interviewed by Richard Boylan, who wrote a book, Positive Experiences with Extraterrestrials. And the guy was taken on board and shown a book. It had a purplish cover. It's always really interesting. These covers are described as metallic, purplish, jeweled, shiny, and it had an orange sunburst on top. And they said, you need to read this and you will remember it when you're 31. So he was a young man, a teenager, I believe. And at age 32, he remembered it. He said basically it was all about, again, philosophy and psychic abilities and treating the earth properly and environmentalism and this sort of thing. And so I started collecting more of these cases, and there's a lot of them. I found a bunch, actually. I think it was over a dozen, but I'm still finding new ones.
So what is there like any indication on what we make books with paper. I mean, what are these alien books? What's some of the descriptions of the feel of them? Like what kind of material do you think is being used?
Well, cover, Dolly Saffron had this experience. I got more information about it than from her, because she has no fear, doesn't use hypnosis. She says the cover was like a sapphire. I'm like, was it a sapphire? Oh, no. She said doesn't know what material it is. It's not metal. The pages are different too. It's not paper. They're usually described as glowing or glassy-like. So we're not really sure what they're made of, but these are not normal books by any means. Jim Selver, I think that's his name, Jeff Selver, had this experience where he was taken on board. They showed him a book, kind of a shiny surface again, and it downloaded him. So he's looking through it and boom, it all comes at once. So he couldn't comprehend it for a while, but ended up writing a book about his experiences and devoted the last chapter to it. But yeah, he described it in the same way and said that it was about the power of love and how to manifest things and spirituality and psychic development and how to levitate and all these kind of really deeply philosophical subjects.
Was it
Dolly's the same
was it
thing.
written in words, or like how was it presented? Like
He,
how I
he
mean,
didn't see it in words. Well, with Dolly Saffron, sometimes holographic images, sometimes words. She says it'll interact with you if you ask it a question. It can even play music. So kind of like a Harry Potter almost type of book. I mean, this is not a book as we would think of it, but sometimes it is. There was a kid from Georgia who was taken on board and given books, and he said that they were all about the importance of preserving our environment. And they'd take him to the little library section, and that's what they would teach him. So sometimes they'd take him to a little toy section. He was a little kid, and he would play with little alien puzzles, which he thought were to sort of test his intelligence or how he's progressing. But yeah, Whitley Strieber had this experience, described it as a jewel-encrusted surface. But oh my gosh, here we go again. It's the same description. And he saw another book another time, which he described exactly as Betty Andreas and Betty Hill, a kind of shiny metallic blue surface. And he did remember, and I don't think it was regular writing as we would think of it. I don't know he described it in any detail, but he said it was all about how religion and spirituality have meshed throughout human history and evolved over a period of thousands of years. So it differentiates in some of these cases. One lady described it as light language. One lady, because I put out a call on social media, and I got a bunch of responses. Some people said, yeah, I saw it. They gave it to me. I read it. I don't remember what was in it. One lady said, she heard me describing Dolly Saffron. She's like, I know she's telling the truth because everything she said happened to me.
wow.
So yeah, once Dolly tried to take it from the ship and take it home. She's like, well, it's my book. Why shouldn't I? She's a kid, mind you. And it's grown over the years. So it's a book that evolves along with the witness. But it's always on craft when she goes there. So, well, it's my book. I'm going to take it. They took it back, and they gave her a little bit of a tongue lashing. Yes, it's your book, but you cannot take this off the craft. If someone were to get a hold of this, this could prove very dangerous for them, for you, for us. No. You are not to do that. And they kept it from her for a week or two after that. But yeah, apparently, because one lady who contacted me, she's like, I didn't see my book on a UFO. I had a near-death experience. And I saw my book during my near-death experience. And that rang a bell to me because we've all heard of the term Akashic plane or Akashic library.
Yeah.
And I talked to Dolly Saffron about that. She's like, well, yeah, actually, they're the same. You can access it there. There's this very strong spiritual aspect to UFO encounters that is often censored out of people's accounts. And it shouldn't be, because that's why we haven't heard about this. When someone has a high strangeness experience on board a UFO, they're reluctant to talk about it, even to researchers.
Because they think it's too weird, and just so you'd be afraid that nobody's going to believe you if you tell anybody.
Yep, exactly. That's why I really wanted to put this chapter out, because I know a lot of people are having this experience. And it turned out to be true. I just found another case from a guy who had an experience at age 16 while driving in Northern California. He was taken on board. It's a very benevolent experience. It is for most people, I must say. There's some fear for a lot of people, which can cause them to interpret it as negative. But most of the people I talked to are so glad that they've had this experience, ultimately. But at any rate, he saw 2 books. And he said they were flipping pages by themselves. I read them. I don't know what was inside them. I saw symbols. What's really interesting with the Betty Hill case, she wrote these symbols down, right? Under hypnosis and consciously what she remembered. And one day, I told Dolly Saffron this. I'm like, well, Betty Hill actually wrote the symbols down. She's like, I'd like to see them. Because she's had fully conscious experiences and has been taught how to pilot the craft, which may sound crazy, but Grant Cameron wrote a book about this, Sky Pilots. A lot of people I've interviewed a number of people who have been taught how to fly the craft. This is a thing. And so I showed her the symbols, and she lost her mind. She's like, I know what these mean. I'm like, you're kidding. It's like, no. We ended up talking to Kathleen Martin, But at any rate, Dolly basically said that these were symbols that will appear on a heads-up display when you're piloting the craft. They talk about, how the craft is getting powered up and skiffing and turning and this sort of thing. They're basically, it's kind of like not a complete flight manual, but along those lines.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Very,
thought that was so fascinating.
Yes, and I could see why that was because this was something nobody's been writing about or talking about much, and that's why I think that this is probably your favorite chapter.
I asked Dolly Saffron about it. I don't suppose you've seen a book. And she smiles like, well, as a matter of fact, I have. Because, she, like many witnesses, was very reluctant to talk about a lot of stuff. She finally did agree to go forward, but in the initial interviews, I'm like, you need to be a little more forthcoming. Tell me, I probably heard this before. But that's absolutely normal with witnesses. They've been burned over and over again by skeptics and people who are quite vicious, ridiculing and disbelieving. So the climate's so hostile for years and years and years, and still it is a little bit.
Oh yes.
We made great progress.
We made some progress, but there is some hostility toward all of this. I mean, the issue is that as far as I'm concerned, anything's on the table right now. I mean, there's just the proof is there for as far as I'm concerned. Like you were saying earlier that you don't talk about trying to prove or disprove. You don't even have to, because you're presenting so many different stories. I mean, it's right there. It's in your work. I mean, you're just showing everybody, look at all these different incidents over all these different years, all these different people. If that doesn't tell you that this is real, then I don't know what will. Basically, that's what I see with what you're doing. That's how you do. That's how you do.
Thank you. Yeah, because some guy's like, well, you're presenting all these cases. Prove to me they're real. And I told him, it's not my job to prove. It's your job to, build your own knowledge base. I am presenting you with factual evidence, vetted, true as far as we know. But it's up to you ultimately. And that word, UFO believer, I hate that. Because no, it's not about believing UFOs. Belief and knowledge are two separate things. Either you know or you don't. And I hate that word. Well, it's your truth. No, truth is truth. It doesn't belong to anybody. Truth is, what it is. So in this field, there's a real problem with that. People really need to stop believing the lies told by our governments and stop believing this absolutely ludicrous, scientifically impossible stories that are coming out of some of these, I'll put this in quote, experiencers, because I don't think they're experiencers. Either they've been in my lab, or they're lying, or they're government agents. I don't know, but some of this stuff that's come out there in the field right now, I'm like, people need to wake up and do some basic science 101 research. And it's frustrating. People say, there's no evidence. Well, let's go down the list, shall we? Where
do you start? I mean, there's not only evidence. It's not only, okay, there's a lot of stories out there, and you cover a lot of them. I talk about a lot of them. A lot of people talk about them, where there's only witnesses, sometimes only one witness, sometimes multiple witnesses, but there's no other proof, just their word. Then there's other cases where there's evidence, where there's marks in the ground, there's burn marks, vegetation marks. I mean, then there's pictures, there's video, there's all kinds of different stuff out there. And if you don't realize it by this point, I don't know if you'll ever realize it. I mean, then you don't if you don't believe it, and you don't, maybe that means you're just disinterested in it and you don't want to believe it. I don't know, because it's real, it's actual. There's no question about it as far as anyone should be concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely indisputable that people are having these experiences. And you can interpret it whatever way you want, but we know this is real, 100%. And it's a rare contactee that doesn't have another witness or a healing or animal reactions or electromagnetic effect or a landing trace or a photograph, some form of evidence. So yeah, the evidence is there for those with the courage to examine it. And there's the key word, courage, because this is a subject that dives right to your core belief system. very much akin to politics and religion, even, or because it defines who we are and our place in this universe. And some people are just not willing to go there because it offends their sensibilities about what they think they know about this world. And if you have to rebuild your whole belief system, well, it's more comfortable just to, I'm not going there. And that's, I think, the root of skepticism. It's because it's not easy. I know for me, it was really uncomfortable. I was not a happy camper when I found out UFOs were real. I had to reevaluate everything. I became, ironically, much more skeptical because I'd been lied to by people I love, by our own government, by the school system. Never once mentioned UFOs. This is a big part of human history. We should know. It's ridiculous that this is been covered up. Thankfully, it was a complete disaster. We all know what UFOs are. The cover-up is leaking like a sieve. So.
It's over. It's coming to an end. It really is. Well, I want to say this, Preston. I want to thank you very much for coming on the show today. And I want to tell everyone out there, this is Preston's latest book right here. Not From Here, Volume 5 by Preston Dennett. You're over 50 books right now. And this is his latest one. And what we were talking about here today, that was just a taste of the book. I love the book. There's a lot of stuff in here. If you're interested in the UFO topic, well, pick this one up. And I will have links for everything for Preston's website, as well as for this book. And as well as his YouTube channel, which is, I'm sure a lot of you out there already know about that, I'm sure. So thank you very much, Preston, for coming on the show today. I appreciate it very much.
Hey, it's a true pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, thank you all for joining us. Until next time.